Welcome to this afternoon's first plenary, Bold Reforms to Engage a Changing Electorate. And I want to emphasize the word engage, because there's been a challenge in messaging research and polling that we have tried to unlock over the course of the last 3 years, starting in the money and politics sector and realizing that the money and politics sector is really not a sector. It is part of a broader democracy reform movement if we listen to the people and to the research. And so we are here today to talk about what it is that we're seeing in the research that engages the electorate, that helps them overcome cynicism, that helps them remember that their votes count more than anybody else's money. But right now that is not where the public is, and we have to help them get there. And the way we do that is by paying attention to the message research that has been invested. I have had the good fortune, a career of about 28 years now, of being the recipient of a wave of investment that philanthropists made starting about 30 years ago to improve strategic communications in the nonprofit advocacy community. Specifically in the democracy reform movement, we are now at the crest of about 3 years and more than $1 million of investment in reframing projects that have helped to underscore the fact that the public sees this as one issue, whereas we might see it as several. We have now seen the findings coming out of investment starting in the money and politics sector that evolved from specific policy-focused work that now point the direction very clearly towards a broad democracy frame, and that underscores that messaging and framing is not a silver bullet, but a process. And that we start with policy framing, we get to larger message, specific policies polling, and we get to larger message framing, and that when we get to a place where project after project after project is reinforcing the findings, similar findings from each, that we know we have arrived at a place of solid information that we can trust and rely on, and that is the happy place that we find ourselves in today. There have been 3 major research projects: the Purpose Institutes for Issue 1, the Topos for the Ford Foundation, and Lake Research for the Democracy Initiative. I have had the good fortune of working and had a hand in guiding each of those 3 projects with my friend Joanne Schwartz at Civitas, with my friend Marissa Brown at the Democracy Initiative, and at Rethink Media, where my friend Ginna Green will speak from later, and I used to sit. And through that work, we have seen not only those 3 projects come with amazingly consistent findings that we can all rely on and count on, but we have a 4th that had nothing to do with this community or the democracy reform movement, but came from the Women's Donor Network, that also acts as, and serves as a control group on those 3, unexpected and unplanned, but confirms the findings of participation, of the importance of participation and framing, the importance of representation, of balance, of fairness, and the importance of talking from a place of values as opposed to process. That process has its place, but it comes after the values discussion. And the other thing that is showing up not only in these polls, but in some work that Stan Greenberg has done in this cycle, suggests a sequencing, because of the cynicism that people feel, that we have to address first before we are going to engage them in our reform issues. So, like Ginger Rogers, we got to do this in heels and backwards when dancing with Fred Astaire. But what that really tells us is ultimately we have a conversation and a path for it that starts with a broad values frame that talks about our democracy and how people talk about that, and gets us then to the process issues that we all care about and work in and specialize in and go to get to dive deeper in, because our responsibility is to do the deep work on legislative and legal nuance. But that's not where the people are or how they talk about it. So the additional responsibility we have, and that this panel is here to address, is the responsibility we have as advocates to talk in the way that people do about these issues. The last thought I will share with you before introducing the panel is to repeat something that Desmond Meade said to us yesterday, which is that to not think about these issues and to talk about them in the way that the people we are trying to help and serve are thinking and talking about them is malpractice. I will say it is advocacy malpractice. And so now I'm going to introduce you 4 people who will never need to buy advocacy malpractice insurance because they do this right and well. First of all, from the Brennan Center, Myrna Pérez. She is the Deputy Director of the Democracy Program. My colleague, Stephen Spaulding from Common Cause. He is our Policy Counsel and Legal Director. Angela Kuefler from the Global Strategy Network. And Ginna Green, the Managing Director of the Piper Fund's Money in Politics and Fair Courts Communications Collaborative. Each of the speakers is going to present from their policy or messaging perspectives on voting rights or money in politics, and then we'll have a round of questions and get to yours. Myrna, you're up.
I am a bit of a troglodyte. Oh, perfect. Buenos dias, I'm Myrna Pérez. For those of you that I don't know, I direct the voting work at the Brennan Center. And I think we're all here today, and I appreciate my partners and friends and clients at Common Cause for convening all of us, because we are in a space where there's a lot to be discouraged about. We've had the lowest voter turnout in 72 years. Consistently around election time, scores of voters indicate that they have a problem on election day trying to register and vote. There are millions and millions and millions of people who are eligible to vote but choose not to be registered or are facing too many barriers or have not been able to encounter a reason or a motivation to become involved. And that's only part of the story. That's not even talking about the near 6 million people that we have just cut out of the system and are saying that these folks cannot participate in our system because they have a criminal conviction in their past. Let's not be coy about this. This is a tremendous number of people, about 4.5 million people that we are expecting to live and work and pay taxes and raise families in our community. If all of these folks lived together, it would be the second largest city in the country and is the equivalent to about these 4 states. On top of that, we all know that we're going into a presidential election, and we are facing a period in time where voters have fewer federal protections than they've had in 50 years because of the Shelby County decision and what it's done to the Voting Rights Act. And 16 states have passed laws which are going to make it harder for people to vote, and those laws are going to be in place in 2016. But none of us here are folks who sit on our hands, who move to Canada, who feel like there's nothing we can do. We're all here together because we feel like we're at a moment where we can take the offensive and where we can win if we do this right. And I'm going to go through 2 reforms that I believe will be transformative, will accomplish our goals of bringing more people into the body politic, and are something that if we do right and we do strategically and we do smart, we can win. The first is automatic registration. Why do I think we can win this? Because we kind of already are. We've gotten it passed in Oregon and California. We also got it passed in New Jersey. It was vetoed by the governor. But it is something that is gaining a lot of steam. The major Democratic presidential candidates are talking about it. Huge influx of money from people that are not in our movement are coming into the scene. Everybody's really jazzed about it. The president is talking about it, volunteering to stump for it and doing so. For those of you that aren't in the democracy space, what do I mean by automatic registration? It's actually a very simple concept that comprises of 2 small and modest changes that are going to have an impactful and transformative effect. The first is we're switching the presumption. We're changing the default. Right now, you don't get to register unless you take an affirmative step saying, I want to register to vote. We're blowing that up and saying, you know what, if you're eligible, you're on the rolls unless you tell us you don't want to be. The behavioral economics say that this default switch, this switch in presumption, is going to change behavior. The second thing that it does is it transfers the information electronically. In just about every state in the country, if you decide to go into a Medicaid office or a veterans office and they actually do the job, which they often don't do, of asking you if you want to register to vote, you then have to fill out a piece of paper where you have to give people the same kind of information that you just had to give them a minute ago to get the service that you wanted. That is unnecessary, it is expensive, it is time consuming. If we have the computers speak to each other, that eliminates a lot of the problems that we are experiencing. In terms of messaging, it's important to remember that this is not compulsory registration. This is not mandatory registration. We understand our Constitution, in our constitutional right to vote, that you have a constitutional right to not vote. So if you do not want to register, there's a mechanism, and there needs to be a sound and a real mechanism for not participating if you don't want to be. But for those that do, this should be just regular doing business every time you go to a government agency. Why do we think this is going to be a transformative effect? Well, if we do it smart and we do it right and we do it everywhere, we can capture a lot of those 51 million people who are unregistered. It also saves money because it is colossally expensive to print out those paper forms, to mail them to the election office, to pay someone to data enter all of them. It takes up tons of labor and time. It also will increase our role, so all of those fraud peddlers out there trying to tell us that everyone's trying to steal our elections and we can't have any reforms because someone's going to steal our election, this gives them one fewer thing to complain about, because no poor clerk has got a stack of papers that they have to decipher someone's chicken scratch and then hand enter it in with all of the typos that they've been introduced. Going to be cleaner and neater. It also means that if we're doing our updates and doing it in a extensive way, that we're going to constantly be updating our rolls. So we don't have to worry about somebody dying, not still being on the rolls. We don't have to worry if someone's moved, that they're on in two places. So all of these folks that are concerned about double voters and people showing up that are ineligible, if we structure this right, we can eliminate that. We know that from the states that have just done the electronic transfer part of it, that this puts more people on the rolls. And it makes sense. It's not an extra step you have to do when registering. You don't have to decide if you're going to fill out a piece of paper when you're trying to get your benefits and have to go and catch your bus and you've got your kid crying, right? Like, this is just something that you say yes and they transfer the information over. The states that have used electronic transfer have found an increase in the amount of people that register to vote. We also know that there's a ton of excitement in the country about this. Right now, more than half the states, I'm going to say this again, more than half the states have introduced legislation to bring automatic registration to their state. Now, not all of these acts of legislation are what I call passage ready. Some of them are pretty crude. Some of them don't get the policy exactly right. Some of them would need a lot of amendments. But from basically over a period of 1 year, we have gotten so much momentum and so much energy behind this that this is the reform that folks are talking about and folks are excited about. And I, for one, am really thrilled that there are so many people that are jazzed about this, and I think that we are at a very specific time where we need to structure what we're doing in a smart way, and when we do this, we can start getting these passed in more states, and once we have them passed in more places, it's going to take on a life of its own. You guys might remember that that electronic registration and online registration were a vast minority of the states as few as 5 years ago. Now more than half the states have them. Once we show that it works, it's going to happen. Second big reform, restoring voting rights to people with criminal convictions in their past. We are at a moment in our country where there are many conversations happening among people of all political backgrounds about the need for criminal justice reform. The Koch brothers are behind this. Right on Crime is behind this. Newt Gingrich is behind this. And I say shame on all of us if we aren't able to transfer some of that energy to make sure that those people that are living and working in our communities aren't able to get their rights to vote back. We had an enormous victory in Maryland recently where we overrode a gubernatorial veto that's going to get 40,000 people back on the rolls, people who had previously been shut out because of their past criminal convictions. Law goes into effect tomorrow. We also had a victory in Kentucky. Yeah, it's very exciting, guys. Very, very exciting. We also had a victory that was 10 years in the making in Kentucky where we got the governor to issue an executive order that would have pardoned up to about 140,000 people who were permanently disenfranchised because of Kentucky's law. Now, the next governor came in and rescinded that order, so we are still working in Kentucky to try and find people who we think have their rights restored. We're going to be advocating for them. But there's a lot that can be done because the states have a patchwork of policies. They range from permanent disenfranchisement states where it doesn't matter what you did, how long ago it was, how young you were. If you have a felony conviction, it's a wrap. You don't get your rights to vote back unless the governor pardons you specifically. And then other states like Maine and Vermont. where you never lose your right to vote, even when you're in prison. And what I would hope we would do is concentrate over the next few years to make sure that every state on here is green, right? If you're in the community, you're living and working, the people are there. That's a reform most people can get behind. We just need to push them to prioritize this and do this. Lots of things that are exciting, things that we need to watch over for the next few years. At the end of the month, there is a Supreme Court hearing on Iowa's law, which is also one of the states that permanently disenfranchise people. There's a lot of ways it could go down, but one way is one in which we'd get 20,000 people who are living and working in their community back and having their rights to vote back. My compadre and brother, Desmond, I'm sure spoke yesterday about the effort in Florida where we've got about 1.5 million people who cannot vote because of a criminal conviction in their past. Way too many of them are brown and black. Way too many of them are brown and black. And there needs to be resources and a strategy, but it is winnable. I have seen the numbers. We just need the resources to do it. And then in New York, which is one of those wackadoodle states where you can vote if you're on probation, but not if you're on parole, and the only people that understand that are criminal justice professionals. Election officials don't get it, community members don't get it, advocates don't get it. There's an effort that's trying to focus on this so that New York will make it so that once you're out of prison, you'll get your rights to vote back. You know, Colorado's also got a law like that. California's got a law like that. We need to do some work on this. And it's encouraging because we've seen 14 states this year introduce bills that would ease the restrictions on people with criminal conviction. 4 of them, Republican-sponsored or co-sponsored. 4 of them, right? That there's a lot to build from that. And one of the things that I'd like to leave people with is that the only bill introduced thus far that would go back is some sour grapes people in Maryland that want to make the people that just got their rights back only be able to vote in absentee. They're not going to make it. The public is with us, and a lot of the legislators are with us. We just need to give them the courage to focus on this and expect them to do so.
Good afternoon, everyone. Post-lunch, lull. Well, again, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Myrna. Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon, everyone streaming this live. All right. And if you want to tweet that out, it is commoncause.org/live. So, I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, and was thinking about it yesterday, and we can talk about problems. We can talk about the fact that each presidential candidate is likely to spend $2 billion each on their behalf for the presidential campaign. We can talk about the fact that much of that money is going to come from 1/3 of 1% of the US population. We can talk about the problem that arises when over $500 million is coming from secret sources, known only by those on whose behalf that money is spent. We can talk about a lot of problems with the way that we pay for our elections in this country, and ultimately we can talk about how that money, the dollars and cents, skew public policy toward the wealthy few and not the many. But I suspect that like 85% of Americans, 90% depending on the survey, you get the problem of money in our elections. And like 85 to 90% of the American people, you probably agree that we've got to look at some common sense ways to change the system and explore where it's working well at the state and at the local level. So I was going to talk today about how a number of organizations, many of whom are in this room, are talking about policies that put our democracy back in the hands of people. And I'm going to talk about one campaign that 13 organizations are working on right now called the Fighting Big Money, Empowering People 21st Century Democracy Agenda. This is a document and a policy proposal that we have collectively put out in the ether that campaigns are taking and running with and talking to voters about at the presidential level increasingly we'll see at the congressional level. And there are 5 principles that motivate this agenda. 5 principles of democracy. A democracy where everyone participates, where everyone's voice is heard, where everyone knows who is trying to influence your views, where everyone plays by common sense, fair rules, and where everyone is held accountable. So those are the 5 principles of this democracy agenda. Let's talk about the policies that undergird each of those principles. First, where everyone participates. Here we can talk about small donor public financing programs, programs that provide incentives such as matching funds to empower the voices and the contributions of small donors. And we know, as we've seen, have we already seen the video on public financing, how this is advanced? We've seen that. We explained how Common Cause has been working on that program, how we have leaders in this room, Karen Hobart Flynn, Miles Rappaport, that pushed this forward in Connecticut, where 75–80% of elected legislators are using this program and running on the contributions of their own voters and not out-of-state donors. We can talk about at the presidential level, as Trevor Potter, the president of the Campaign Legal Center, has said multiple times, a very striking statistic that President Reagan, in his 1984 re-election campaign, attended a grand total of 3 fundraisers, and they were all on behalf of the Republican National Committee. President Obama, in 2012, participated in 223 fundraisers. That's a lot of time. We know that these programs change the way that candidates and elected officials spend time with their own constituents. We know that it can increase the number of donors, small donors, as I said, donors that elect these candidates and not out-of-state donors. It can reduce barriers to running so that people like you and me can actually mount competitive campaigns. We can diversify the set of candidates so that our legislatures look more like our communities. And ultimately, I think we'll start to see policies that are supported by the many, and again, not just by the few. We also, of course, need a democracy where everyone's voice is heard. Fair, common sense contribution limits, particularly when paired with small donor empowerment systems, are an important way to ensure that everyone's voice is heard by their elected representatives. 3, a democracy where everyone knows who is trying to influence their votes. As I said, over $500 million since Citizens United came from undisclosed sources through partisan front groups, through LLCs contributing to super PACs, through sham social welfare organizations. The list goes on and on. And that's just counting, by the way, that's just federal money that we know about. Thanks to the folks at Open Secrets and the Center for Responsive Politics for crunching those numbers. We also know that much of the money is sloshing around, of course, in state elections and in judicial elections. There are proposals. There is the Disclose Act that would shine a light on this outside spending. The Disclose Act passed the House of Representatives in 2010. It actually got 59 votes for cloture. 39 senators voted against it, but because of the rules of the Senate, if the threshold of 60 is not met, then the scoreboard, 59-39, the trophy goes to the 39 senators that voted no, and so the Disclose Act did not get an ultimate floor vote. That doesn't mean we're going to give up. The Disclose Act has been reintroduced multiple times, and we're going to continue to advocate for its passage. But there are also actions that agencies can take that are squarely within their authority. We know that the Federal Election Commission could revise and update its disclosure rules to deal with Citizens United so that voters can follow the money, so that voters know who is speaking to them, so that voters can hold their elected officials accountable and know what pocket those elected officials may be in, and so that we can enforce our laws. The Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury Department need to update their regulations that have not been updated since 1959, but that deal specifically with social welfare and candidate-related political activity, that we need to reconcile the rules so that, again, we can shine a light on the spending. The FCC could enact true identity regulations so that when a broadcast ad is aired, you instantly know who is funding this ad. We know that at the state level in Massachusetts, Pam Wilmot's in the room with Common Cause Massachusetts, in Rhode Island and other states, there are innovative disclosure reforms that are moving where top donors are disclosed in the actual ad. We think that the FCC can move on this. And of course, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, could require public companies to disclose political spending to their shareholders. And the President of the United States, who famously called out the Supreme Court to its face in his first State of the Union, could sign an executive order requiring government contractors who receive billions of dollars in taxpayer money to disclose their secret giving. We already know where their PACs are giving the money. That's disclosed. Where is the money going that's in secret? I think the American people deserve to know that. We hope that the president will act. 1 million people have asked him to do so. So we need to work on disclosure legislation. As I said, we are seeing active efforts at the state level. We need everyone to play by fair common sense rules. And by this, the agenda is talking about transforming the jurisprudence around money in politics. And there are vibrant efforts underway across the country that Common Cause and many others are part of to amend the Constitution, to overturn Citizens United, Buckley, other decisions. We also know that the Supreme Court could overrule Citizens United, Buckley, and other decisions. The Supreme Court has put us in a box where only corruption or quid pro quo corruption or the appearance of corruption, those are the only justifications for our campaign finance laws. There's other justifications too. In the 113th Congress, the Senate Judiciary Committee considered a proposal by Senator Udall to enact a campaign finance constitutional amendment that inserted into the conversation the concept of political equality, inserted into the conversation preserving the integrity of our democracy. Those are other justifications that could uphold our campaign finance laws. Justice Stevens, retired Justice Stevens himself, who wrote the 90-page dissent in Citizens United, which is a terrific read, testified in the Senate Rules Committee about the Disclose Act, and himself talked about how corruption cannot be the only justification. Curbing corruption and curbing the appearance of corruption cannot be the only justification to support our campaign finance laws. He said specifically, leveling the playing field, so that just as there are rules governing litigation, many lawyers are familiar with equal time in the court of law, equal page limits, that justification of an equal right to persuade, equal rules on the football field, equality, political equality, that concept that every citizen comes to the political table as equals is also a justification, and one that we will continue to see, I think, animate our campaign finance jurisprudence. And then finally, we need a democracy and a system where everyone is held accountable. The former chair of the FEC, Ann Ravel, has articulated that the FEC is worse than dysfunctional. And we have seen time and time again, as recently as yesterday, three commissioners in particular who are ideologically opposed to the enforcement of our campaign finance laws, ideologically opposed to those campaign finance rules, period. And because of the gridlock, because of the system, the 3-3 split on the FEC, that results in no enforcement whatsoever of the rules. There are now proposals, bipartisan proposals, in the House of Representatives, and Senator Udall just introduced a proposal last week in the Senate to restructure the FEC so that we don't have these 3-3 splits. Perhaps one commissioner who's in place for 10 years with an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. Perhaps a system similar to the Wisconsin Government Accountability Board, which Governor Walker recently dismantled, but was the gold standard for nonpartisan enforcement of our election laws. So we have seen these proposals work at the state level. We've seen it work before at the federal level, and we'll continue to move the path forward. But those are the policies, I think, where there is widespread agreement and support to put voters back in control of our democracy.
So we've had a quick look at both voting rights and money in politics policies. We're going to shift now to the messaging side, and Angela's going to talk about some voting rights research.
Thank you. Is there a way to pull it forward?
Thank you very much. My name is Angela Kuefler. I am a researcher at Global Strategy Group. I do a lot of political research, but over the last few years have specialized a bit more in research development for issue advocacy campaigns. I am but one person in a fairly large team that has been helping Your Vote really dig in on a comprehensive message strategy for automatic voter registration. So I'm going to talk about that pretty specifically. Before I dig in, I want to level set a little bit and go back to some things that Scott said in the beginning that I thought were right on point. One, this is part of a democracy reform movement, right? Automatic voter registration is but one piece of this agenda and one tool in it to help us get even more wins on the board, to help us engage the electorate that we discussed is very important, and to help snowball this movement. So this is one tool. The other piece that I think is incredibly important is that there isn't a silver bullet, as you said, when it comes to message research and framing. And we look at this research on this particular topic as part of that process of developing that message. So I wanted to clarify that before we get started. Okay. So a couple important notes. This research didn't start in a vacuum. We did do a pretty comprehensive look at what other people have done in the past, both on this specifically and on voting rights generally. So our intention was to build on some things that had already been done. The other important note here is that we just got started. There is a lot we are still going to do through this year and next year. There's a great many things that we have learned from this research so far. There's a lot more we have to learn. There are a lot of questions we don't have answers for quite yet. So to dig right into some of the key findings when it comes to how voters perceive elections and the voting process. So our research shows that a pretty solid majority see voting much more as a right than a privilege. Now, that said, there are very clear demographic differences here. If you are a liberal or a moderate, you are much more likely to see voting towards being a right. If you are conservative, that leans a bit more to seeing it as a privilege. Voters are also not particularly content with the process of voting and registration right as it is right now. Only 37% think that the process is just fine the way that it is. So there is some discontent there. The largest concerns they have are around integrity in the system, the integrity of the system, but then also there are groups that believe that apathy in terms of people just deciding not to vote or believing they don't have to vote, that is the bigger concern as well. There is also a strong belief, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, that special interest money and big money in politics is severely detrimental to the voting process as well. I want to talk about fraud for a second here, and I will a little bit later as well. This research shows that most don't see voter fraud as a hugely rampant and pervasive problem. Certainly, they see it as more of a problem than is actually everyone in this room actually knows it exists, right? But it didn't pop quite to the level that we were expecting it to. That said, Republicans and those more on the conservative side of things are deeply concerned about it. Even if they don't think that it's this huge pervasive problem, they still worry about it. Now, more of the center-right people, African Americans, they believe that apathy is a problem. Now, I want to make one thing clear. There is not a great belief among any of these groups that voting is too hard or too difficult or too cumbersome. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. We also asked them what goals, when it comes to voting reform broadly, what goals do you think voting reform should have? And in this concept of integrity that I talked about, that is near the top, but that is definitely trumped by all eligible votes are counted. That is the main goal people want in voting reform. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what eligibility means because it's a little bit different depending on who you're talking to. When it comes to automatic voter registration in the specific, there is this sense that the system is modernized and outdated, and automatic voter registration can help with that. I don't have to explain what automatic voter registration is since you all just heard, so that's great. So we put the proposal up in front of them on this online survey. It mentioned a secure voter registration database. It mentioned the concept of portability, all of these things that are part of AVR. And that got an overwhelming 78% support. Huge support across the board. Now, only a third of those are strong support, and I think there's a great opportunity to grow that number, but generally we start out in a very, very positive place. And I think that's because voters see automatic voter registration as a solution to some of the discontent they're feeling with the process and the system already. So let's talk a little bit about messaging for a second. When you start out with 78% support, the goal of the messaging is to do a couple things. One, increase your strong support, right? So that 34% number, get that higher. But also to prevent drop-off in your soft support, to inoculate against what will likely be opposition messaging. Because especially when you start talking about some of this stuff, people do get a little unsure and they start to fall away. So what we wanted to do is how do we prevent that drop-off? The other thing we wanted to do is look at where that drop-off, what messages actually drive that drop-off from the other side. What do we have to be worried about? What do we have to inoculate against and respond to? So the top messages in support of AVR centered on this concept of the integrity of the system, protecting the right to have your vote counted, and reducing the cost and waste associated, basically the bureaucracy associated with voting. So there's a couple of interesting differences here in who you're talking to. If you're talking to people center left, they most strongly respond to a message on protecting the rights of all eligible Americans to have their vote counted, right? So it's an inclusiveness and all piece of it, all eligible votes. Center right responds strongest to messages that argue the proposal will reduce the chance of ineligible voters taking advantage of an insecure system. So for them, it's about counting only eligible votes. Automatic voter registration will also reduce cost and waste. This also pops. I mean, it's fairly safe to assume anytime you're trying to convince center-right or right-leaning voters about something that, you know, getting rid of government bureaucracy, that definitely helps. Now, going back a little bit to fraud, it didn't. So when we read this proposal, or when they saw this proposal in front of them on the screen, and then we asked, "What problems do you foresee with this?" Not no one, but the concept of fraud didn't pop at quite the levels we were necessarily expecting. That said, when posed with a fraud message against this, it did pop with right-leaning voters, center-right voters. So it is something we need to keep in mind that they are susceptible to that. That said, when we talk about electronic system replacing a paper system, replacing a very insecure paper system, that does ease some fears about fraud. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through the data. I just wanted to, so you're not just reading text, show you some charts. We asked how well, we gave them a list of terms, and we asked how well that describes the current process of voting or registering to vote. And you can see number one, makes it too easy to commit fraud. But look at the party differences here. 32% of Democrats say this, 58% of Republicans. Next one on the list, makes it too easy for ineligible people to vote. Again, huge differences here. 20% of Democrats, 66% of Republicans. On the other side, too hard for eligible citizens to vote. That's where you have the high Democratic response here, 58% compared to only 20% for Republicans. And way at the bottom of the list, I just want to point out is where we see cumbersome and inconvenient. Those are generally not problems most people believe that are part of the system. Looking at the proposal itself, we have, like I said, strong 78% support. Certainly there are some demographic differences. Democrats, younger people, African Americans, those who have experienced problems with voting, they're all more likely to support. But that said, this is a relatively boring slide because everyone likes it. And that's a great position for us to start in. One other thing I want to highlight when we're talking about messaging, we asked a very open-ended question. What would be the best thing about this change, about automatic voter registration? What's the best thing about it? And this concept of security really stood out. Again, it's much more with the right of center, the Republican-leaning groups, where this comes into play here. You can see the differences on the top there. And then for Democrats, it's much more about, again, protecting rights, protecting the vote of eligible voters. Okay, so where do we think we are right now in terms of how we talk about this issue and this policy? We did, without going into too many detail, we did a fairly extensive test on if there's a better way to talk about this in terms of labeling and the name of it. Long story short, the automatic voter registration is great. It works best. Electronic voter registration is also a good option, but we can stick with what we know here. So the message in favor of this particular proposal, it has 4 primary components. It will make sure all eligible votes are counted, whether you are Democrat, whether you're Republican, no matter who you are, your vote will be heard, your vote will be counted. It will also ensure that those who find it challenging to vote will be able to participate. So we see the theme of participation. And a particular point here, what center-right people in particular are worried about with participation is military voters. So people who are going from base to base, that's who they're concerned with being able to participate easily. It will reduce the chance that those who are not eligible to vote here will be able to take advantage of an insecure system. This is especially important for the center-right group, but there's some Democrats that do also believe that security is an issue, or an insecure system is something that they need to be concerned about. And then we have the modernizing the outdated system and eliminating wasteful red tape and saving taxpayers lots of money. Again, concept of military messengers I talked about. The one final point I will make is that we need to make it clear to a lot of people. A lot of people, when they read this, they assumed this was a federal program, and that is not something people are generally as supportive of. So we need to clarify as often as we can that this is a state-based system that will be run by your state. So like I said, we are, I think I'm at time, so I don't want to take too much of it, but we are just getting started on this process. There is a lot left that we have to learn, a lot we have to build from. You can see on the screen some of the other pieces that we are going to be working on in the next year, year and a half. So thank you so much.
And final presentation from Ginna Green, the Managing Director of Rethink Media.
Thank you, Scott. I'm Ginna Green, and I think that PowerPoint and reply all are the scourges of the modern workplace, so I do not have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk. Is that better?
Is it on?
She can have mine.
Closer, closer. Better? All right. Thank you, Common Cause. Thank you, Scott. The subject of, and Angie, thank you. Angie really dug in on AVR, and I'm going to think a little bit broader and also pivot a little bit from, well, not pivot, a little bit, pivot from voting to money and politics, which, the subject of which exists in a unique place in the American political conversation. There's almost no other issue where public opinion research demonstrates more widespread agreement among the American people about the nature of a problem, and yet where the solutions seem out of reach for an equally large majority. Virtually all Americans across demographics, across party lines, recognize that there is something fundamentally wrong with our democracy today. In fact, Global Strategy Group data indicates that 91% of folks agree that money in politics is a problem, yet only 9% believe that something can be done to reduce its influence in the next few years. Which goes back to Scott's earlier point, that our biggest obstacle these days when it comes to engaging Americans on this issue is combating the public's own cynicism and hopelessness. So in our efforts to do that, to move Americans from that cynicism to action, we must reach new audiences with new frames, stronger messages, and engage members of the new American majority, women, people of color, young people, Democrats, Republicans, across the board. The opportunities exist for us to, through new frames and those stronger messages, make new allies and strengthen the diversity of our growing movement. Importantly, and to our advantage, most voters already understand this connection between their frustration on policy and the dysfunction in the political system and money's outsized role in it. They understand that big money politics limits the people who run for office, limits the people who win office and the policies they consider, and quite frankly, disrupts democracy as a whole. It's up to us to connect for those voters the kitchen table issues that are already important to them to money in politics, be it the environment and climate change or mass incarceration and criminal justice. Money in politics is the one issue that affects all of these issues, and we must make the connections to people's lives and to their futures. So essentially what I'm saying is that we've won the debate over whether or not there's a problem. The next step is to win the debate about the achievability of meaningful solutions. To that end, yesterday, I don't know who all was here yesterday, but Norm Ornstein and Ian Haney-Lopez had a great conversation about tribalism and the tribalistic frame and messages that the right has used for decades successfully. Dog whistle politics, Ian Haney-Lopez especially mentioned, used by media, elected officials, and thought leaders with messages of racial division, messages of government ineptitude, messages of fear that essentially foment race and class warfare. But the frames and messages that motivate our target audiences, the people we're talking to, the people we want to engage, don't look like that. Personally, as a side note, I am fascinated by the neuroscience research that suggests that people on the left and people on the right are actually wired differently, and so they think differently about these issues. I find that really fascinating and think it has tremendous import in messaging and what we do. And it underscores the differences in the frames that motivate the right versus the frames that motivate the left and motivate our base. And arguably, this concept of persuadables, the movable middle, swing voters, the people who make up about 77% of the electorate. This is a big audience. These are the people we need to talk to. But we're also talking to our base. We're talking to Democrats. We're talking to people of color. We're talking to young people. And as Scott alluded to, there's been multiple research projects over the last few years that aim to sort of to speak to these people and to engage them on this topic. So what that means when it comes to winning the debate about the achievability of meaningful solutions means mobilizing that base, mobilizing and motivating that middle. And so I'm going to talk about the frames that came out of that research that Scott mentioned that we can use to do exactly that. Quick poll. Does everybody know what a frame is? A frame, like a message frame.
Yes.
Yes, everyone does? So should I go do a primer or no? Yes? No. Okay, excellent. I'll skip that. But I will say, as an example of what happens when we successfully use a frame to shift a conversation is what happened with the marriage equality movement in terms of successes. They were able to shift public opinion by having people think about marriage equality as about love and freedom as opposed to sex and sexuality. And so they were able to really move minds and change policy in the process. That's what we need to do. We need to move with money and politics frames and related messages to shift the public response from I'm pissed off, but nothing can be done about it, to one of we can fix this and the time is now. So what I'm going to go through the frames that Topos, research from the Topos Partnership and from Purpose Institute and from Lake Partners, and you'll see I might say Topos or Lake, and I'm going to be referring to those bodies of research. There are 4 key frames that I want to bring up and recommend to this audience that came out of those pieces of research. One is this notion of a system that's out of balance. This out of balance system produces an unrepresentative selection of wealthy elites who run for office. It shifts public policy, as Steve mentioned, in favor of wealthy special interests and favors big donors rather than everyday Americans. People get this concept of a system that's out of balance. It makes sense. And a frame like this has embedded within it sort of a positive aspirational perspective that we can actually achieve a system that is more balanced and does work. It doesn't state a goal that many people believe is unachievable, like getting money out of politics, because a lot of people think that's just not going to happen, but rather sets the bar at building a system that works where all voices are more equally heard. Another key frame that came out of the research was the concept of equal voice and equal say. They found respondents, most of the research projects found respondents very receptive to forthright messages about inclusion and exclusion, and irrespective of party affiliation, people favorably responded to this simple principle of fairness, that every citizen should have an equal voice and an equal say, and that every voice should be heard. If you want to extend that concept a little bit further and talk a little bit more about the reflective democracy piece, you can talk about a system dominated by wealthy special interests precludes us from achieving that. We don't get to reflective democracy when we have a system where people don't have an equal voice and an equal say. And in this era where we've got diverse workplaces and rising of the new American majority and the like, women graduating from college at higher rates than men, we had this opportunity for some of the best candidates for public office being completely shut out of the process. While classrooms and boardrooms are rapidly becoming more diverse, diversity in political representation is lagging far behind. And that really makes the case that the current system doesn't work for us all equally, and that we don't all have an equal voice and an equal say. Another frame that came out of the research from Purpose Institute was this notion of the price we pay. And it found that it was that research found that it was a very effective method for moving people quickly through the problem of money in politics, because it enables folks to connect the issue to something that already resonates with them and something that already makes sense. So what you want to do in this price we pay frame is set the stage for talking about a wealthy special interest and exactly what they're doing to sort of curry favor and curry interest, and the price that we all pay as a result. An example of using that frame would be when oil and gas companies make big contributions to candidate campaigns and spend millions to lobby lawmakers, we all pay the price when strong climate policies are stifled and the sustainability of the planet for future generations is threatened. This formula really moves people through the money in politics problem really quickly, and it makes the problem more concrete and a little bit less esoteric. The one thing I want to note, though, is that people do need to be moved quickly through this frame, because what we don't want to do is offer up a problem again and then have people sort of resort back to that cynicism. So we do need to have the solutions piece as part of that, just to combat exactly what we're trying to combat in terms of public engagement. The final frame that I want to talk about came out of the research from Topo's partnership, and it's this barriers to running. One of their major findings was that they had a dramatic shift among respondents when they were asked their views on eliminating barriers to running for people like me to serve in elected positions. Respondents really expressed deep cynicism, deep disillusionment over the prospect of ever getting money out of politics. But they expressed genuine excitement and enthusiasm for solutions that would remove these barriers to people like them running for office. And that's because people sort of intuitively get that running for office has become so expensive that it's nearly impossible for a regular person to get elected, and as a result, they don't believe they get representatives who look like them or who know how they live their lives. Similar to the frame related to achieving a system that's in balance and working to improve a system that's out of balance, the barriers to running, rather than focuses on the impossibility, really, of getting all money out of politics, this frame shifts respondents' focus to the positive considerations of what government and policy would look like if people who were elected in office more accurately reflected their communities, their lives, and their needs. So what do we do with these frames? The answer to the question of how we use these frames to move our base, move the movable middle, the rising American electorate, the new American majority, and how we get folks to really move on these issues, is that we need to do two things with these frames. No matter which frame you adopt and whatever your specific messages take shape as. Messaging aspirationally. That means we have solutions, we have a growing movement, we have bold reforms on the books and on the table. We're winning, we're on the verge of winning even more. So what we need to do is continue to grow this movement, make connections from money and politics and voting rights and redistricting, the very solutions that Common Cause has brought us here today to discuss, to the impact on voters' everyday lives. And we begin with an aspiration, discussing the problem, discussing the solution, and close aspirationally. The research was very clear. The delivery of the frame is very important, and it's increasingly important to start strong, start aspirationally, and close that way too. But in the middle of all that, once we've had this conversation, once we've created the space to have these conversations about the problems of money and politics and the threats to our larger democracy, we actually do still have to talk about the solutions. We do have to talk about the bold reforms because people don't think we can fix the problem. So it's not that solutions are just the answers to the problems of reducing big money's influence or voter suppression or politicians picking their voters and rather than voters picking politicians. Talking about solutions is going to be how we communicate that these problems are fixable. This is really the linchpin of convincing voters that something can be done. And we talked a lot about the various solutions that are in play and on the table. I mean, some of us are working on, Steve mentioned, court jurisprudence, and some of us are working on small donor matching systems, and some of us are working on AVR, but all of us need to recognize the very important role that solutions are going to play in our messaging in order to combat that cynicism. Really quickly, am I out of time, Scott? Am I out of time? I am out of time. Okay, so I will quickly run through elements of a strong message. You want to be aspirational, you want to counter cynicism, you want to connect with your audience, you want to be able to address real solutions, you want to describe a growing movement, you want to make sure, as with any good story, you want to make sure you identify a villain. We've got a villain here. Wealthy special interests are at work undermining our democracy. That's who we're fighting. So how will we move Americans to action? We'll do exactly that. We'll reframe the conversation. We will make connections, we'll be aspirational, and we will offer solutions that work. So let's do it.
Thank you, Ginna. Thank you, panel. With 2 minutes left, I want to welcome you to the first ever Blueprint lightning round. Ginna, 30 seconds. Why should we stop talking about corruption?
Good one. Why should we stop? Well, because talking about corruption leads people directly back to cynicism. What we found is that while it is a message that does resonate, it doesn't resonate as well with our target audiences as other messages that refer to equal voice and equal say and the like. But also, it's just, how do you fix a system? If you believe, if the corruption frame requires us to believe that politicians are essentially inherently corrupt. Time's up?
Time's up.
Damn it.
But you got the answer right, correct. Angie, 30 seconds. You said we were just getting started in the voting rights community and the good research in the pipeline. Do you see the research leading you in the same direction that that Ginna has just discussed in the money and politics community towards a broader democracy frame?
I don't know. I think there's a lot we still have left to do. I think we should consider this research, it's slightly different, right? It is but a tool in this larger reform movement, in this larger agenda. I think there's a lot of things that are consistent, and I think the rest of the research will help get us there. I do think that there is a little bit of a difference. This is still, we talk a lot about the process, but our research does actually show that there are still some significant values at play depending on which groups you're talking about. So this concept of fairness, an equal voice and an equal say, that does resonate overall. I think in particular with the center-right and the right-leaning people, there's also this value of security and feeling safe and protection. And I think that the strength of some of our messaging is coming from that value as well.
Oh, well done. Steve, 30 seconds. There are lots of policies we could talk about in both money and politics and voting rights. Why are we focused primarily on the issues right now of money and politics and automatic voter registration?
So I think the title of the panel was about, at least in part, engaging an electorate, which means inspiring people, which means, I think, both blue sky thinking, but also meeting people where they are and where we've been before and proving that we can win again. And so we're seeing that with AVR. Post Shelby, you know, this is where we are proactively bringing people into the process, and I was really struck by the statistic that, you know, over half the states have already introduced legislation. Might not be the gold standard language, but the idea is sinking in. And then money in politics, again, the research shows that it is a gateway, it is an entry point that paves the way toward other reforms. If you can meet people where they are, which is they know that the system is rigged, we can move on to better reforms.
Thanks. Oh my God. The conference gods have smiled on this panel. Myrna, we're going to stick with the lightning round, 30 seconds. Give us your reaction to what you've heard about messaging so far from a voting rights policy perspective.
I think that what's evident is that we actually need policy advocates and strategists to be paired with messaging folks, because there's no one, for example, automatic registration policy. In fact, there should be 50 of them, because every state is different in terms of their felony disenfranchisement law and what their state computers look like and how good their data is. And so if you do not have someone that is going to actually be in the mud working out the policy details for a particular state, you're going to be testing the wrong thing sometime. We also need to remember that in very many of the states, we're not going to be able to win this from a left perspective. We're going to have to be catering to the middle, which means being flexible about what we put up in front, and do not ignore elites. I don't care what the average person that we've been able to persuade about fraud is. Chris Kobach, the guys that are going to be the biggest problems for us, they come out with these messages hard, and we need to be ready to beat them more so than we need to be able to beat the voter that we can persuade when we get to.
Brilliant.
Under 30?
Yeah, brilliant. Not only was it under 30, it was brilliant. And I'm going to stick with you because of its brilliance and Chris Kobach.
Okay, I'm ready.
45 seconds on this one. No, we'll go full minute. Why is it, do you think, that the opposition comes so hard and has more discipline when it comes to messaging?
Because they, by definition, have less of a constituency that they have to serve. We are more diverse. We have different interests. They align 99% of the time, but not 100% of the time. And giving full voice to the people in our movement and the people in our community is going to be a little bit messy. So,
Democracy's messy then.
beautiful and messy.
Yeah, I also think their values are slightly different, right? They value authority, and they value consistency, and we value diversity and perspective. And so I think the people, our own internal constituency is different, and our own values are.
Well, and then if I could just one more thing.
Please.
The other thing is that some of it, I believe, is pretextual. Like, those guys are not stupid, right? They see the same statistics that we have that constantly, consistently say that it's not that big of a deal. I think that they know that it's not that big of a deal, but it caters to someone and gives them an excuse to do something. So it doesn't really matter how accurate we are, they're going to come out and trot it anyway, and so we just need to make sure that they're not gaining ground.
Gina.
Accuracy has never been an obstacle for them in their messaging. So, and they've had a lot of practice doing it. And when you talk about, the progressive movement has taken us decades to get to where they are in terms of encouraging that message discipline.
Steve, slightly different question to you. In addition to voting rights and money in politics, there are other democracy reform issues that we work on at Common Cause. Do you feel that this messaging, this sort of five everyones that you talked about, can encompass the full spectrum?
Absolutely. This is about a participatory democracy. This is about bringing people into the process, bringing voters into the process, bringing constituents into the process, bringing citizens into the process. And so I think those five everyones, that notion of an inclusive, fair democracy, that is the key that unlocks all, not just these policy proposals, but substantive issues as well.
Incredibly smart and brilliant panel, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.